Hi, I'm Ed Whittingham, and you're listening to Energy versus Climate, the show where my co-hosts David Keith, Sarah Hastings-Simon, and I debate today's energy challenges, highlighting the Albertan and Canadian context. If this is your first time joining us, Energy versus Climate is a live webinar and podcast that drops every other week. Visit energyversusclimate.com to register for updates and get exclusive access to join our live webinars, ask us questions, and engage with us directly. On today's Energy versus Climate show, it's science versus politics. How do you reconcile what the climate science tells us needs to be done with what is doable through policy and politics? To help us unpack that question, we have climate scientist and former BC Green Party leader, Dr. Andrew Weaver. Andrew is a professor in the School of Earth and Ocean Sciences at the University of Victoria and was a lead author of IPCC scientific assessments. But to millions of British Columbians and other Canadians, he is perhaps best known for his time in BC politics crafting climate and energy policy with Premier John Horgan. He talked with us about what it's like to dive into Canada's energy versus climate bunfight. You won't want to miss this one. Now on to the show. Hello everyone, and welcome to episode 18 of Energy versus Climate. My name is Ed Whittingham, and as always, I'm joined by my usual webinar co-hosts, Sarah Hastings-Simon and David Keith. From here, where I sit in Canmore with a whole family at home, 2 kids in online learning, streaming right now, and a crappy neighborhood internet line thanks to Shaw. So hopefully we make it through uninterrupted.
You're looking for Shaw sponsorship now, are you, Ed?
I'm just looking for Shaw.
He's looking for TELUS sponsorship.
As I tweeted, Shaw, fix my internet line, my neighborhood's internet line. I'll leave it at that. Listen, I first did, you've already heard his voice, first really took notice of our guest today back in 2007 when the Financial Post published the Climate Change Power List, which was back then the Post's exclusive guide to the climate power brokers, the ones who have the most influence on climate in Canada, and why. And the list included mostly politicians and academics.
I made it.
Yeah. They had like the former Prime Minister Stephen Harper, former premiers Ed Stelmach, Gordon Campbell, late Jim Prentice, our own David Keith. David, if you remember that from all the lists that you popped up on since then, and even guests that we've had on the show like Mark Jacquard and Elizabeth May. Now, only 2 on that list of 20 served as both academics and politicians, and only 1 is both a climate scientist and, by his own description, a now recovering politician. And I referred, of course, to today's guest, Dr. Andrew Weaver. And I will note for the record that his other distinction is he's the only one of the 20 on that list who subsequently and successfully sued the same publication for libel. And if you can guess the other academic cum politician who appeared on that list, put it in the chat box, and I will give you a shout out later in the show. Go back to 2007, put on your thinking caps. Now that Andrew has moved back to science, we have invited him today to reflect on his time in politics. So it's science versus politics on energy versus climate. What is different between the 2 fields? What is the same? What is surprising? And how do you reconcile what the climate science tells us needs to be done with what is actually doable through policy and politics? Now, first, about our guest. So Dr. Weaver is a professor in the School of Earth and Ocean Sciences at the University of Victoria, where he's now returned and had a long, successful tenure there. He was the lead author on multiple IPCC scientific assessments. He's formerly the Canada Research Chair in Climate Modeling and Analysis. And Andrew, we should have had you on a couple shows ago when we covered energy and climate models with Ken Caldera. But to millions of British Columbians and other Canadians, he is perhaps best known for his time in BC politics as a former leader of the Green Party, the BC Green Party, and for his work with BC Premier John Horgan to craft BC climate and energy policy in the past decade. So welcome, Andrew Weaver.
Thank you very much for having me. It's great. And nice to hear you had Ken on your show. He's a great scientist with a lot of insight.
Great. Yes, we enjoyed it, and we're going to enjoy today's conversation. So, Andrew, I want to go back to the beginning of your political career. So you were elected in the 2013 provincial election in BC as the first Green Party MLA in BC's history. And by then, you're already the party's deputy leader. So tell us, why did you leave academia, where clearly, according to that 2007 list, you had influence as a very prominent Canadian climate scientist, but why did you leave academia to work directly in politics?
Well, thanks for that question. I've been working in the field of climate science since the 1980s. And when I graduated from high school in 1979, climate sensitivity, we'll all know, this is the single most important metric describing our collective understanding of the science of climate change, which is how much will the world warm if you double atmospheric carbon dioxide levels. Well, in 1979, it's a very famous year when not because I graduated from high school, because of the Jules Charney report that was appeared in the US. And at that time, climate sensitivity was estimated to be somewhere between 1.5 and 4.5 degrees. So along goes my career in academia. I've participated as a lead author in the second, third, fourth, and fifth IPCC assessments. And during those subsequent 35 years or so, guess what? The single most important metric summarizing our collective understanding of the climate system was still 1.5 to 4.5 degrees. It was very clear to me that all this science is making us know more and more about this problem with greater and greater certainty, but nothing's being done about it. I taught a class called Climate Society that I developed at the University of Victoria. It's a class that I just taught this past term too. It's a class that goes beyond just the science, but into some of the ramifications, energy policy, climate policy, human interactions, things like that. And every year towards the end, I would ask, the students would ask me, how can I make a difference? And I'd say, there's 3 things you can do. Number 1, you can, you'll have a wallet, like I have a wallet, and you can send a signal to the market through your purchasing power as to what you deem to be important to you. That's really important, to use market forces to actually drive change. Number 2 is we recognize that this problem of climate change is really a long-term problem. Today's decision makers will not have to live the consequences of the decisions they make. And ironically, the youth of today are not historically participating in our electoral systems, yet they are the ones who have to live the consequences of said decisions. So I'd say to them, number 2 is to vote. It's important to vote. And then I would ask, and then number 3, of course, was education. Tell everyone you know to do 1 and 2. But when I asked about the voting, I would typically ask students, how many of you have voted? And invariably, 50% of students would vote. And I'd ask, why didn't you vote? And I would get responses like, oh, they're all the same. Politicians don't care about me. My vote doesn't count, blah, blah, blah. Despite the fact that my good friend and colleague, Vicky Huntington in Delta South, won by 1 vote. But nevertheless, so I would, say back year after year, well, if you don't like who's there, consider running for yourself or consider volunteering. Try to get people in place who will actually put intergenerational equity or long-term thinking into their decision-making process. And I did that year after year after year. And as the 5th IPCC assessment report was coming out with, yet again, climate sensitivity, 1.5 to 4.5 degrees. And at the 4th time, I was approached by James Turk, who was the then leader of the BC Greens. I said, you know what? At some point, I got to take a look in the mirror and saying, as an academic, I can shout at the clouds. A lot of people shout at the clouds. Or I could try to make a difference. And I thought I frankly just couldn't go back into that class. I couldn't write another scientific paper knowing that we don't need more science to tell us what the problem is. What we need is solutions. And so I accepted that request to run as a BC Green in a riding that's just had a 17-year sitting Liberal cabinet minister. Liberal in BC, for the listeners, is Conservative. And I did it. I didn't think I was going to win when I started. I did it because out of a point of principle to try to raise the political discourse on climate policy. There is a long history in BC. We don't have time to go into that about the pendulum swing back and forth with climate policy. And lo and behold, I got elected. And I had to my academic colleagues thought I was mad because I had to give up my Canada Research Chair, and I gave up my Lansdowne professorship, and NSERC very quickly asked me to give them back the grants that I had. And So I went very rapidly from the academic to politician, and through my efforts into that regard.
Well, there's lots there, Andrew, and I like your analogy of shout at the clouds, or a shout out to the movie network. Your moment of I'm mad as hell and I'm not going to take it anymore.
The happening to win sounded a lot like the story about Angus McClintock and the Best Laid Plans. If folks haven't read that, it's a great 100%. Canadian novel. It sounds almost like it was written about you, Andrew.
Yeah,
Angus McClintock is my hero, except he was an English prof and I was a climate science prof.
Yeah. So you're climate science prof, and then you basically had this quick and dirty immersion into political science. And so now let's say, and by being an acting politician, being an active politician, and very influential at that. So now
I think acting was a good expression. Let's stick with that.
Dig in at my colleagues in political science departments. I think the relationship between political science as taught in academia and politics is it's a big gap.
Yeah, fair enough. And acting, I like that. If for books, I think of Rick Salutin's The Age of Improv to show how an improv actor became prime minister years ago. And let's not forget, we have a prime minister who worked as a drama teacher. So yeah, but sorry, I want to bring us back. Okay. Bring us back to the question. So you're now, and if you were to teach a class at University of Victoria, which you do, and you're talking about how to drive effective climate and energy policy. Now that you've done that, you've had that career, you're back in academia. What are your top three lessons?
Well, yeah, thanks for that question, because I did teach that course in the last session, and it was a very different course from what I taught prior to going into politics, from getting out of politics, and one of the things I learned in politics, and it's a lesson that I now convey, is that there are a myriad of stakeholders in the decision-making process. Decisions being made by political decision makers are very difficult at times. We've got the Fairy Creek old logging right now in BC as a case study of that, if you're interested in following up on it. There, science is but one input into the decision-making process. There are union groups, there are disability advocacy groups, there are employee groups, there are business groups, there are myriad stakeholders. And as a decision maker, particularly when we held balanced power in a minority government, you had to be respectful of a variety of views, because you were actually there to elected to represent everyone, not just what you want. The other thing I learned, the second thing I say now, is it's very clear to me that the political system in Canada, in the US, in Australia, in many Westminster parliamentary democracies is simply not set up to deal with long-term problems. There is far too much pendulum swinging between parties coming and going, and that ultimately is a direct consequence of first past the post. I would argue that if we want to deal with the grand challenges of times, politicians need to work together and stop trying to find the gotcha moment to get into power to do what you want to do for your stakeholders. I think that's why if you speak to John Horgan, Carol James, and others, why we were so successful is that we recognized that we had to work together, and so we did. It's very difficult to do that unless you're in a minority government, unless you have proportional representation. And as you will know, most of the progressive nations worldwide that are actually taking challenge, Great Britain, a notable exception, taking the lead in climate mitigation, have different forms of government. The other thing is the issue of education. It's very clear to me that you can't just do what you want to do unless you bring people with you. The key thing is to actually ensure that you might have something you want to do, but in order for you to do it, you have to ensure others are there with you. Otherwise, it'll just get overturned. And so it was those three things, with the latter being grounded in hope and solutions. People don't want more people shouting at the clouds. Everybody, it's really easy. I mean, we all, like David's, we've all done this with grad students. It's very easy to say to a graduate, you tell grad students, I know what you don't like. Okay, that's fine. But if you don't like someone's science, that's criticizing it is really easy. I can do that. You can do that. Tell us what you do instead. What solutions do you have? And so I approached politics and suggested that others, if they're interested, approach it with the notion that if you don't like what government is doing, fine, tell them what you would do instead. Otherwise, all you're doing is following Homer Simpson's father and shouting at the clouds with no actual solutions in place. And that's not helpful for the advancement of public policy.
Good. Okay. Well, I mean, in a bit, let's try to get to some of those solutions. I know, and if I'm not overstating it, one of your crowning achievements, your time in policy, would be influencing the Clean BC program, the work you did with Carol James, George Heyman, John Horgan. But turning to David and Sarah to get your take, because David and Sarah, you're also both scientists who dabble in politics, not as directly as Andrew, but you're certainly influential in your own right. So Sarah, from your perspective, science versus politics, what's different? What's the same? What is surprising?
Yeah, it's a big question. I mean, I wanted to pick up on one thing that Andrew was saying around, how can we make progress within different government systems that we have? And so some of the research that I've done in the past really looks at this and focuses that question around the concept of winners and losers in climate policy. So if we enact climate policy, if we ultimately, make a transition to the types of resources that power our energy system, there are going to be winners and there are going to be losers. And I think a lot of the ability to, get things done within any given political system is if you have, first of all, it's easier if you have more winners than losers, because you have basically more people that are going to like what's happening than not. But then thinking also about where those winners and losers have power. And so one way sort of through that mess, if you want, is within regions where the potential winners have more power, or they simply are more of them. But I think also sometimes there's quite a lot of examples, I feel like, of climate policy that's happened where almost by accident, not quite, but like for example, Norway, that we all hold up as this amazing example for adopting so many EVs. If you start to dig back and through the history of why they had such strong incentives for EV adoption. It wasn't some grand plan that the government had to say, we are going to push EVs in a major way. But it was actually quite a funny story that includes the pop band a-ha, who, in addition to giving the world Take On Me, also gave the world EV subsidies in Norway that sort of were put into place in the 90s, and nobody really paid a whole lot of attention to them because there weren't a lot of EVs that you could purchase. And, it's sort of before people noticed, all of a sudden it came out. And so that's a very long way of saying actually that kind of policy that happens, I think, has a lot in common with experimental science, where, you can, in some cases, you go into things, and some of the biggest discoveries and biggest leaps forward in science happen not, when we're find from an experiment what we're expecting to find, but actually when you find something that is not what you expect, and you sort of, it's not what you expected at all. And so I think there's some similarities there within the policy space as well.
All right. And David, thanks for that, Sarah. You were on that 2007 list as well. You're a very well covered scientist, regular media commentator. And as any listener or viewer of Energy versus Climate will know, you've got very particular views on policy and what politicians should be done and what they're consistently failing to do. So how do you reconcile science versus politics?
I don't. But I can say that in talking with Andrew, we had a chat a month or so ago. I was struck by the resonance of for both of us, having worked on this topic for 3 decades, Andrew a few more years than me. It's just thrilling that there's so much activity. It's thrilling that it's the top of the news cycle. It's thrilling that major politicians really seem to be doing something. The youth movement is thrilling. It's amazing that there seems like there's real sense of action on climate. I worry, maybe too much, maybe as a nerdy academic, that there's a rise of kind of nonsense that just gets repeated as truth in the news cycle. I'll give you an example from The World at 6, CBC last night. Give you 2 examples. And I worry that nonsense is, will end up making this whole thing less politically stable, because people who are skeptical will just, see how much nonsense is becoming practical wisdom. So like The World at 6 last night, I was losing it as I was cooking. two things. One was a casual statement that about a show about local gardening in Toronto. That was wonderful. Really interesting people on local gardening. Great. I love local gardening. But just assuming that growing food locally reduces carbon footprint. To be clear, if anything, the evidence points the other way. The evidence is certainly not clear cut that that's true. And the other one was a casual thing saying the growing season in Canada is getting longer and less predictable. Longer, obviously, less predictable. I am unaware of any high quality studies that say that. In general, when you reduce the pole to equator gradient, mid-latitude forecasting gets a little easier. But it's one of those things that gets repeated again and again, even in the New York Times, about predictability of climate, of weather under climate change. It just is not related to anything in the scientific literature. And I do worry about that. And I worry that some of there's some kind of ideas from the progressive left, where I feel like I'm culturally from, that are nice ideas of things I'd like about different kinds of local eating or local transportation that are really pretty unrelated to what you actually want to do if you really are serious about driving emissions down quickly. Mm-hmm. And that we're not quite ready to have the hard trade-off conversation yet that we have to have if we're really going to drive emissions down.
Yeah, and David,
I completely agree with David there.
Yeah, and I wanted David, so an example closer to home. In addition to being an academic, you took a detour into the world of business, founded a company that has a climate solution that is at risk of having a certain irrational exuberance attached to it. And speaking directly of direct air capture, how do you reconcile that? And be clear, direct air capture, you've always said it's engineering, not science, but how do you say, yes, it has potential, but don't, how should I put this, without letting politicians sort of run off and saying, yes, this is the latest, greatest panacea for the climate problem?
I mean, some of that is just natural. And we have a separate show on that because obviously the company's doing really well and I might actually stand to make money from it, and I'm thrilled. And I do think that developing that technology, both the one that our company developed and our competitors, and broadly carbon removal, I think is a useful piece of the toolbox for climate. And yet at the same time, I think it's the case that there's been a little kind of overhype around direct air capture and carbon removal, which is there for easily understood political reasons, because it looks like something that's relatively easy compared to the actual hard choices we need to make for emissions cuts now. And in practice, in kind of rational climate strategy, you want to try it now. You want to actually build some real plants so you can understand what things really cost, not what some startup company says they cost, and begin to work on learning curves. But my view is you don't want to do really large scale deployment until you've already begun to really take a big bite out of emissions, which we haven't done yet.
Great. Okay. So
I do think I just kind of coming in because I gave an example how I think science and politics are alike. And I think the flip side of what David was saying and Andrew was agreeing with about how they're different, for me, it was actually really an eye-opening experience to go from, being trained as a scientist and then kind of moving into this other world and having to kind of accept that, science isn't perfect, of course, but there is a pretty good system set up of, peer review and conferences and ways in which, we try to really strive for some sort of scientific, truth. There's biases in there, but at the end of the day, there's still sort of the community is built around this trying to get to that truth. And I think, we do have to accept that that's not what politics is about. And that's frustrating as a scientist and as someone who, wants political discourse to be completely fact-based and, just sort of whoever presents the best evidence and has the best case, that's what we end up doing. But I think sometimes, and I'm not accusing other people. I think this is for me as well too. But sometimes when scientists get into this space, they can be a little bit naive and kind of say, well, we need to make sure that everything that's being said is correct because, that is our highest value.
100%.
100%. That can be a problem as well.
Or worse, the naive view, and I'd love to get Andrew on this in a second, is the idea that science can provide the answers. Science can tell you something with uncertainties about if-then questions. If we do this policy, what happens?
And
if we
Andrew,
do this policy, how many people die from air pollution? Science cannot tell you how quickly we should cut emissions. And that's I actually love Greta. I just love her.
Yeah.
That's the core weakness is it's not true that we just listen to scientists.
And that is what
policy debate.
That is what in this climate study course, that's what I said all along. The issue of, what level of warming do we collectively deem as acceptable. Well, that is a value judgment. And it'll be very different if you live in the Seychelles, the islands, or the Mauritius, or Tuvalu, compared to if you lived in northern Alberta, compared to if you lived in Britain or Denmark. So this is why it's such a difficult problem. And just to address, if I could, what Sarah raised up, I quite like this little expression, because it as a scientist, we are historically and traditionally evidence-based decision makers. In politics, there's a whole bunch of decision-based evidence making. That is, they know what they want to do, and then they seek the evidence to justify it after the fact. Whereas in science, we look at the evidence and then determine what we want to do. And that was the single most difficult transition thing I had to learn, is that I was coming from a background that the evidence is there. It tells you an answer, an obvious logical answer. It's the way we think. But in fact, many times the decision was made, and then you start to see, evidence being thrown up to support something that doesn't make sense. That is a problem, I think, in the way a lot of decisions were made in Canada.
So, Andrew, I'll share a story with you, because when I ran the Pembina Institute, one person who shall remain nameless, but a prominent environmentalist, said in so many words, listen, yeah, because the Pembina has a reputation as an evidence-based organization, and it tries to just advocate based on what the research would show and not succumb to hyperbole. And this activist said, you have such a reputation and influence. You don't have to be as earnest as Andrew Weaver, This like, you don't have to be as earnest as Andrew Weaver, But so,
well, exactly. I'm taking that as a compliment.
I'm taking it as a compliment as well. Yeah. This is a mutual flattery. We can all pat ourselves on the back for that. But that was a caution coming from that person. But so, what I want to talk about, how do you reconcile, the challenge of long-term thinking for climate and the short-term orientations for government? And give us a few, use the Clean BC plan as an example.
Give us some dirt.
Yeah, give us some dirt.
So,
and there's some good things in there, but let's be frank, there are also some compromises. So how did you reconcile that trade-off while you're helping to craft it?
So, before we had a minority government, I had 4 years in the legislature as the lone BC Green, actually the lone MLA anywhere in the country who was Green at the time. We had Elizabeth federally. And so I spent that 4 years trying to focus on the opportunity. I've always argued that if you should see every environmental challenge through the lens of the opportunity it creates for innovation and creativity to deal with that challenge. And so I spent that first 4 years traveling BC, meeting with the Clean Tech Center. I toured carbon engineering out in Squamish there, David. So I was, the whole narrative was about economy, jobs, because I know that's what politicians like to talk about, is economy and jobs. It was about economy and jobs, but it was about the new economy and the new jobs. It was about the opportunity of being the first to develop the so-called solutions that you can then export. I would argue that, British Columbia has 3 strategic resources that no other jurisdiction in the world has. Number one, we are there's a reason why the Canadian Climate Centre is in Victoria. We're one of the most beautiful jurisdictions in the world to live in with a stable democracy. We can give employers a highly skilled, we want to have one of the best education systems in the world, a highly skilled workforce, and we can attract and retain the best and brightest because of where we live. And on top of that, we have boundless renewable energies. We have geothermal, untapped. We have wind, we have solar, we have biomass, you name it, we have it here in BC. And I would say, why is it that we always think we have to follow this traditional narrative of being hewers of wood and drawers of the water? Let's take a look at Terrace, BC. Everyone in Terrace says we need natural gas. I say, look at your strategic advantage. You're on a rail line between Chicago and Prince Rupert, the gateway to Asia, the gateway to Eastern US. Why aren't you trying to bring industry there to use to a manufacturing industry that uses our natural resources to provide clean, renewable power? Why isn't Google coming up and putting their data distribution centers in Prince George, where it's colder than Oregon, which is where they just recently built one? These are the opportunities that a visionary government could capitalize on. And so that built kind of an understanding within that sector, so that by the time the 2017 election came by and we got into negotiations with the NDP, initially we were circling the wagons because we didn't know how we could trust each other, but then we clicked. And the NDP picked up a lot of this. And you'll see just very recently, they've announced the a $500 million innovation fund in British Columbia targeted to climate solutions. And that was our platform. That was basically in our platform. There was three of us. We talked about creation of innovation funds, about the importance of innovation. We had Alan Winter, a distinguished scientist, as our innovation commissioner, emerging economy task force, all from our platform. And the NDP adopted it and are moving forward with it. So there's a great focusing on solutions, focusing on the narrative that politicians like to talk about, jobs and economy, but also recognizing that you have to have safe transitions. If you're going to go and say we can't build new infrastructure for fossil fuels, then you have to take a look at the region where that infrastructure is and say, what other opportunities are there for the people in that region? And that was the focus of what I did, all solutions based.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Just to put you on the spot, one specific point, in terms of getting to making sure that perfect isn't the enemy of good, you had to, with the Clean BC, you've got a plan that's got specific measures, but it gets you 3/4 of the way to the target with a promise to close the gap. Yeah. Tell us the tension in terms of coming forward with a plan that's essentially 75% complete.
Well, the tension falls exclusively with one particular project in British Columbia called LNG Canada. This is which I frankly still to this day don't believe will ever get built because I just don't see how the market is there for it. Yeah. And I've said that since 2012. It makes no sense. But anyway, the reason the NDP felt, and part of it is there was, when we started to negotiate, John Horgan got off on a plane in January of 2018 to head to Asia to discuss the expansion of LNG in BC. And I thought, well, okay, hang on here. Our confidence supply agreement says good faith, no surprises. This is a surprise. And secondly, we're going to develop a plan to meet our targets. And where's the plan? So I threw this uncertainty bomb into the public discourse. This is Twitter, of course, basically saying if this keeps up, government will fall. And so I didn't actually have support of my own colleagues on that, but it was the only way to actually bring them to the table in a means and ways that actually ensured that we got policy through. But it was a compromise. There was just three of us in the legislature. We could shout at the clouds and demand perfection, but the government would have fallen. They wouldn't have tolerated it. And I understand why, because it's difficult to come to with all these myriad stakeholders. So in essence, we got a good plan in place. The one thing is the NDP felt, that they could add a 2-train, but you and I both know that the environmental permit is for 4 trains, LNG facility, and still meet the targets. Well, you can't. There's no way you can, in my view, because you don't add 8 gigatons of emissions while you're trying to cut, 40 gigatons of emissions. It's just not going to happen. But the good news is I don't think it'll ever get built. So that was a tension. And we, but to your point, the single hardest part from my perspective is, I would argue that the environmental community in British Columbia is incredibly naive, so naive, it's mind-boggling, is that in their demands for perfection, often nothing gets done. And my best example of this is when LNG, the single biggest issue for climate policy, on the day that the LNG giveaway was being passed in the legislature, the environmental community wanted to meet with the Green Caucus to discuss with us what their priorities were. They had no idea at all that this day we were debating and discussing the single most important piece of policy on climate-related policy in, I would argue, British Columbia history. They had no clue. They were, talking about banning straws and things like that. Things that are just, you've got to be focused. You've got to recognize that there are big pieces of the pie and there are small pieces of the pie. And if we're going to fixate ourselves on banning plastic single-use straws, that's fine. I mean, I don't use single-use straws. That's one thing. But we have a global crisis in terms of greenhouse gas emissions, and it ain't going to happen by banning straws. In fact, you might argue that if you bury that straw, you're sequestering carbon.
Or urban farming in Toronto, which probably increases the size of the city and increases transportation distances and is less efficient.
Yeah. Right. Now, I don't want to be the standard bearer for the Canadian environmental community. That's maybe a separate topic, but there are lots of reasons for why.
Well, you were at one point.
That's another show. I would love to have that show, and we could have all our guests back for that show. Okay. Everyone would have to say, so I have something to say about it. But listen, before we go to questions, or actually now I'm going to get us to questions. And I'm going to incorporate something we want to talk about that's very topical, which is the IEA net zero report that came out earlier this week. So I want to get all of you to comment on, and especially the sort of the eye-grabbing detail, which was no new oil and gas production. Or at least that's how it was portrayed. The question is from Nicole Chan: how do we reconcile policy with the science, which you've talked about? But for example, the IEA report says no new fossil gas boilers by 2025. Is that a policy objective that government should be adopting now? So let's just open it up. IEA report generally. Sarah, why don't you go first?
Gosh, there's so much to say about the IEA report. I think we were chatting about it a little before. So, I mean, to me, one of the big things that comes out and why it's getting so much attention is because it's the IEA saying it, right? And, we certainly in recent times hear a lot about how, the IEA has a quote unquote forecast, which is actually a scenario saying that, oil demand is not going to decline. And that's why we don't need to do anything different in Alberta. And so I think having the IEA, a relatively conservative organization that has long under forecasted deployment of renewables, come out and say there is a pathway to net zero at 2050 is a really big deal. Should governments follow these things exactly? I think that comes back to Andrew's point before, which is, the science doesn't necessarily tell you, what the right policy choice to make is. But I think it does tell something really important. And another way that I think the report can be very impactful is that it helps you understand, if the policy choices that you're making are compatible with your stated goal. And so if you have a government that has, for, whatever reasons, decided that, yes, we should be going for net zero at 2050, as we have from, many of the world's governments, it becomes very then black and white to say, well, you have this goal and yet you're not, doing this set of things that are needed to get there. So, what's going on? You're clearly missing the boat here. I do think, by the way, that, we should be moving towards heat pumps and air source heat pumps. So on that specific point, yes, I think we should be doing more. And there's a lot of good reasons that policy is very needed within that space.
Yeah. David, my reaction was, there wasn't a lot new there because the IEA has been saying for years now, going back to its 450 scenario, saying in order to stay within 2C of warming that we need to bend the curve down on particularly oil consumption. And that number is not unlike the number they were publishing 5 years ago. But you found something new in the report.
I would say there's nice detail about how to actually get to zero with sort of sectoral level detail in a global way that hasn't been done before, but it's not that different than what's been done before. No question. The big deal is that IEA is a thing that was created to be the kind of the West's counterpoint to OPEC from the oil crisis. It was really around the fossil fuel industry, although formally that's not its job anymore. And for it to say no new fossil fuels is a big deal, not because it's in any way new to say that we shouldn't be having more fossil fuels. We want to hit 1.5. That's a complete no-brainer. It's who said it.
Got you. Okay. Let's get to questions from the audience, or more questions. Barry McNichol, you're welcome to Energy versus Climate. You've got a question for everyone.
Yes, can you hear me okay?
Yes, you're coming through loudly and clearly. Welcome.
Perfect. So all four of you today have mentioned the word compromise many times, and it clearly pointed out that scientists look at evidence and it tells them what they want to do, whereas politicians figure out what they want to do, and then they look for the evidence. So my question to you all is, with many governments being led by political parties who place jobs and re-election ahead of climate, how can we hope to have a concerted global effort to achieve net zero by 2030? Thank you.
Yeah, I think we should go to the recovering politician on this one. So, Andrew.
Well, that's a really good question. The first thing I would say, I think it's slightly different in proportional representation versus first past the post systems. It was very clear to me from my term in office that many people who were elected viewed the being an MLA as a job. And when you view what you're doing as a job instead of a civic duty, you get concerned about losing your job. So you start doing things to actually keep your job, and you start making short-term decisions like, let's reduce hip and knee replacement lineups, because you know that the 70% of seniors vote, and you know you can throw some money at that problem, solve it, and say, look at me, vote me back in next election. The problem there is career politicians. In my view, I actually think there should be term limits. If it's good enough for the president of the USA, I think it should be that way in Westminster parliamentary democracies that do not have forms of proportional representation, because there is what happens in proportional representation in a first past the post is one party gets all the power. They don't have to listen to anybody, and the other parties are trying to gotcha moment. So to me, that is absolutely key. The second thing is we need more scientists in the decision-making process. It's really tough. Like it's a very different. But if you had more people who got into politics out of a sense of civic duty, who are able to look at data and make decisions formed on evidence, recognizing that there are myriad stakeholders, not just the science community, I think we'd be better off. I look at some of look at Germany, Angela Merkel. I enormous respect. On the climate file, we go back to Margaret Thatcher. Whether you're conservative, whatever, Margaret Thatcher was visionary in the development of the Hadley Centre in the UK, conservative prime minister. Gordon Campbell, she was a scientist as well. Gordon Campbell did the same in BC. If that's what I think politics needs. It needs fewer people thinking that this is a job and I'm doing it out of a sense of narcissism, but more I'm doing it because I care about the actual issue of climate change. And I'm willing to recognize that I have one view and there are other views, and let's get around the table with different toolkits to see how we can solve this.
Yeah, Andrew. So I agree. I'm a fan of Angela Merkel. And by the way, going back to the very beginning of this conversation, the other politician or academic come politician on that list, the only one who got it I saw was Andrew himself, and that was Stéphane Dion. But are we better off with more Angela Merkels, or are we better off with more Xi Jinpings? And I say that because Angela Merkel still is very limited in what she can get done. Xi Jinping in autocratic countries, and this is a wicked question, can with a flick of a switch or by official decree, can shutter 2,000 inefficient factories if they really get the problem.
So, I mean, there's something to be said for benevolent dictatorship if the benevolency is kind of collective good. This is one of the reasons that some of these jurisdictions like China, I have always said, I'm not worried about China getting along and solving this problem from their terms. China decided to ban plastic bags, and so they did, and it was done. And so you just don't have them. In BC, you want to put a bike lane on a street, and you've got the rent-a-mob crowd coming out from issue to issue. It's much more difficult. So there's something to be said, but I'm a big fan of democracy. I just wish we had a form of proportional representation, so we actually forced politicians to work together, because you get better public policy. And I think the NDP, John and Carol would argue that our time together was one that led to good public policy. We've got a ton done. But I worry about, others like China and other jurisdictions like that will come along, and in fact, China's leading in terms of a lot of the technologies right now anyway.
Fair enough. So that could be another show on its own. Another show. Every time we do these shows, we get more show ideas. Let's go to Glenn Gary. You have a question, please. Your mic is live. Welcome.
All right. Thanks, everybody. I'm again going to talk about the IEA report. And as Sarah and David have kind of said, it's who is saying it that really carries the message. So is this, as Canadian politicians, both provincially and federally, have kind of used the IEA reports as high-level cover for their policies, is this finally, the current report and it being so explicit, is it finally enough to make federal and provincial politicians, look at expansion and shut that down cold, or even look at current operations and start to suggest, hey, we need to scale this back?
Yep. David, what do you think?
Is it? I don't know. I would guess not soon. I think the inertia is a very powerful factor and sort of short-sighted self-interest. I think the thing that will change things is really provincial level, long-run self-interest. So this is often pitched as all about climate idealism, and which is the right reason to act on climate. But I think from the perspective of somebody in Alberta thinking about how to make Alberta work in the long run to have a high functioning economy, I think whatever your view, if you accept the reality that oil is going to go, then you actually want to not keep throwing good money after bad. You want to begin to ramp it down so we can shift resources to something else to avoid a really sharp crash.
Yeah, I'd like to just jump in. I thought Andrew Leach, the economist at the University of Alberta, had a good comment on it. And he said, this is a signal if you're an oil producer in Alberta that this is essentially low forever oil prices. Because if you look at it, with falling demand comes falling prices. So if you're going to be making investments, you have to stress test your investments against those new price assumptions. And that's not rocket science. And I don't think it actually needs any kind of policy intervention. I think the fundamentals remain the same for Alberta oil. If you're in the high cost, high carbon quadrant, you'd better find a way of getting to that low cost, low carbon quadrant pretty damn quickly, or ultimately you're going to be shut out of global markets. And I think that understanding is becoming increasingly widely accepted here in the province.
I think it does come back to this question of winners and losers, and when you start to have more of one category than another. And I think we don't always do a great job, particularly when you have a small group of people that stand to lose a lot. That voice can dominate a larger group of people that sort of stand to benefit some, but maybe not by as much. And so, my favorite example of that is, as we sometimes like to talk about on this show, is a tie line between Alberta and BC. So transmission line between Alberta and BC. It's almost like a religion among people in Alberta that that such a transmission line would be a sacrifice. It would be something that we are giving to BC to allow them to send us hydropower. And that couldn't be further from the truth. It would be, it would enable Alberta to build out a bunch of renewables locally, creating, investment and jobs. It would lower the overall cost of electricity by being able to use, the hydro in BC as a battery. There is one group, the peaking gas plant owners, that would lose out because they would essentially be replaced by this transmission line plus local renewables and the hydro. But the narrative that comes out of it is a very sort of different from the reality. And I think a lot of the same thing happens within whether it's, where money should be invested in terms of future oil production or something else. When you have this powerful group that has a lot of ability to shape the narrative, that really directs the way people are thinking. And I think the same thing happens here.
Great. Let's hear from you, Andrew. And then I'd like to get the view from BC, because I imagine this report has been received very differently in BC than it has in Alberta. But first, what do you think?
Yeah, first off, I agree completely with what Sarah said there. It's ironic that the transmission line issue is somehow a gift to BC when in fact it's a gift to Alberta, as far as I could see, because you have amazing wind potential in southern Alberta that is basically intermittent. So let's give you that load leveler. But coming back to Andrew Leach, Ed, it's ironic that he was commenting on the IEA report because he, as you know, worked very closely under the Notley government in the development of their climate plan.
I worked with them closely on that. Yeah.
Right. And one of the things that they were pushing was, of course, the establishment of a tripling of the capacity of the Kinder Morgan pipeline, which was to take diluted bitumen offshore, highly sulfur-laden bitumen. At the same time, commenting on the IEA report, well, nobody was listening to me or the scientific community when we were saying exactly that a decade and a half, 2 decades ago, that, and particularly with the Paris commitment, Paris commitment translated directly to no new infrastructure in fossil fuel development. Otherwise, because you don't build a tripling pipeline to tear it down tomorrow. So there is a lot of inconsistencies out there in the political discourse, in the public discourse, of people who are changing their views based on IEA reports, which is why it's so important. But in fact, the science has been saying this for a very long time. So this is why this report is so important. With that said, it appears in Canada, at least, that in December of 2020, when we get somebody of Jonathan Wilkinson, now the new environment minister, who can see things quantitatively, we actually have a pretty darn good climate plan that was proposed in Canada in December of 2020, finally. Now, whether we get it implemented or not is another question. But we're starting to see policies at national level, and I think we're seeing that continue in BC, that will actually recognize what the IEA is saying.
Got you. Now, it would be loath of us, Andrew, and just take a little diversion from audience questions to have you on the show and not talk to you just about supply side campaigns, the non-fossil fuel proliferation treaty, which has been newsworthy. And you and I on the pre-call talked about when actually we first, I learned of your work in 2007. We spoke in 2012 when you published a study in Nature with Neil Schwartz looking at what would happen to global temperatures if we combusted all global stocks of coal, oil, and natural gas.
Yeah.
And the oil sands industry and government seized upon that at the time, saying, see, we're not so bad, because logically and naturally you concluded that, gee, there are a lot more coal assets than oil sands asset. We combust that. It's going to have a much more of an impact on global temperatures than the oil sands. But use that. So tell us the view from BC, or go back and tell us the view of what was it like to be in that maelstrom back in 2012.
Well, it was odd. I mean, that paper that we wrote, or our opinion piece, was prompted by statements coming out of the US that if we continue to expand the oil sands, it's game over for the climate system. It's game over for planet Earth. Turns out that analysis was based on an error. And rather than going into the details of where that error came from, I felt it was important that we correct the public discourse. And it's better if scientists correct the public discourse than the Heartland Institute correcting the public discourse, because it wasn't very difficult to correct the public discourse on that. So as Neil and I discussed this, and what we've tried to do is to try to put evidence into the decision-making process. I'm not naive that I knew how it would be used by some versus others, but I thought it was important. If science is going to play a role, scientists must be true to the science and not use it deliberately or inadvertently, and if you do it inadvertently, you have to correct it to advance an agenda. So I was viciously attacked by the environmental community, who suggested to me that I shouldn't actually be, doing this because it was undermining their efforts. And there's actually a documentary called Running on Climate, which filmed my 2013 campaign. And it interviews one person there, Ben West. He's a good friend of mine, who was Canadian Wilderness Committee at the time, who talks about about the environmental community's response to this. But as a scientist, you have to be true to the data. I was not trying to say a policy. I was trying to correct the public discourse. But it was tough at the time, because that's one of the reasons why the environmental community didn't actually support the BC Greens in 2013. They were all or 2017. They were all in a flap and a fury about split the vote and stuff like that. We got 17% of the vote, despite the fact that we didn't get the environmental activists vote for us. Right now, we got the centrist people who recognize the opportunity of dealing environmental challenge through the creation of these opportunities. I mean, that was actually quite a remarkable increase in popular vote. 17%. We only got 3 seats. We should have had a bunch more. And it would have been a lot more had those environmental activists actually recognized that we were their best chance to get environmental policy done in BC, and we did, despite them.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and thus at that time, the event, the creation of the slur, earnest like Andrew Weaver.
Oh, was that what it was?
But the counter argument would be you need people on the far side.
Yes.
So to be clear, I think there's some stuff that Extinction Rebellion says that is factually not correct. But I'm very happy they're saying it, because they're saying it helps to move the dialogue, helps to shift the Overton window or whatever. My job as a scientist is to say what I think should happen as a citizen, and also to say what I think the facts are. So some of those facts aren't facts, but we need people in the streets making arguments for change.
And you have the exact opposite side of that spectrum saying the exact thing, like there is no such thing as global warming, where the world is 21 years old. I mean, you have to have these competing narratives in public discourse. And that is exactly right. The role of the scientist is to stay true to the data.
All right, let's bring in Maggie Hanna. Maggie, you've been waiting patiently. Let's hear your question.
Hi, everybody. I'm thinking that there's got to be a minimal viable product kind of mentality. As you said, the perfection can be the enemy of the good, but we need pathways that are doable, where we can take one step in front of the other to get to something that is more ideal than what we're going to be able to accomplish at the early parts of those pathways. And I'm just curious, Andrew, in the same way that a hydrogen methane turbine from Mitsubishi is a way to take a step now that's going to be good in the future. I'm wondering, what are some of the next steps along that pathway that you see that are doable, but in the way that we're not going to be committing ourselves to something that is not climate friendly for a long time. I didn't say that real well, but anyway.
No, good enough, Maggie. Thanks. Appreciate the question. And Sarah.
Yeah, and I think it's really a great question. And it's something that, again, I think the scientists are sometimes guilty of getting bogged down in some of the finer details and don't spend enough time on the message of there's the pathway that we can start on. And, the electricity system is a great example of this. We spend a lot of time on energy Twitter debating how to decarbonize the last 10, 20% of the electricity system, and very little time on the first 80%, which is much more and also a lot easier is, go out and build as much renewable energy you can, as many transmission lines as you can, as fast as you can. And it's very unlikely that you're going to doubt any of that. And I think the same is true within a lot of sectors, that we actually have a pretty good idea of that minimum viable pathway. It is important to do. And that's where I think what the IEA has done and what groups like the Transition Accelerator and others do, where you have to think about these pathways so that you do get a sense of, okay, is there a risk that we're going to spend a lot of money building something that we don't need later? But I think the good news is that if you do that kind of analysis and that kind of thinking, there is a lot that we can do now that's no regret moves. And I think that was one of the big messages from the IEA as well.
Yeah, and Andrew, so you're a rugby player. I'm a hockey player. We know in both sports momentum is important. So tell us about momentum in politics. Like, when you get in, how important is it to just get going and get something going?
Yeah, well, I can tell you my knees will not allow any more momentum on the rugby field from me. But what I wanted to add to that a superb answer by Sarah is that maybe you could repeat the question, Ed, just because I think you've pivoted away from the original question.
Sorry, I know I threw a curveball at you. So just talking about momentum in politics, like just getting going on something to show it can be done, even if it's not perfect. But then, feel free to address Maggie's question.
Right. So I wanted to talk about the specific BC case, because it does address what Maggie does and what Sarah follows up in. Every single jurisdiction has a pie chart, and that pie chart is their emissions. And every jurisdiction is different as to what the big piece of the pie is. In British Columbia, we know that because we have 98% plus of hydropower, we know that the big piece of the pie here is transportation. 40% of emissions in British Columbia is transportation. And that is such a low-hanging fruit. And that is why in Clean BC, we started off focusing on a very dramatic and quite leading zero-emission vehicle standard. It has been so successful in BC that up to 15% of new vehicles in 2020 were ZEV. 10% of registered vehicles are ZEV in BC now. And that is because it's a low-hanging fruit. Didn't take a lot to kick it off. And now, if you drive around Victoria, where I live, or Vancouver, there are EVs everywhere. Alberta's different. Alberta, you look at where your big piece of the pie are. For reasons that I don't understand, you're burning a lot of coal. Look what Ontario did. They had a massive reduction in emissions. They looked at the pieces of the pie and said, coal, off you go. Britain, same thing. Coal, off you go. So every jurisdiction, it is easy to get that initial chunk down just through focusing on big pieces of the pie. Mm-hmm. And as Sarah said, we spend way too much time worrying about the last 10% getting from 80 to 90 instead of worrying about the big pieces of the pie, and they're everywhere. Brazil's stop burning, the Amazon rainforest. There's a huge piece of the pie. Every jurisdiction has one.
Sure. And coal's a good example in here in Alberta, Andrew, because going back to that time, the Alberta Climate Leadership Plan, frankly, it started to germinate around the momentum that we already had with coal and the late Jim Prentice when he was premier, and built upon that. And for all its warts, there are pieces of that, vestiges that form national policy still in place today. Mm-hmm. And getting that coal phase out. One thing in Ontario, really hard to do in a place that was so coal dependent in Alberta. Yeah. Listen, I want to get to, one question. I want quick answers from all three of you, and then we've got to wrap up. So from Donald Sproul, Donald, not sure which. It's occurred to me that the current COVID crisis has created some politicians that are following science-based COVID policy. Does that create a better political environment for science-based climate policy? Yeah, you're chuckling, David, so you got to go first.
All right. I think it's a great question because I think there's been a real cop out of politicians. So, I mean,
not in BC, not in BC, not in BC.
Informed by real science, but it's not like science can just determine the answer. It's the job of politicians to deal with the real risk trade-offs, that there are risks to COVID and there are risks to locking down too hard. And I think, and risk to being too cautious with allowing new vaccines. So I think that, I think it's a very good question. And it points to the weaknesses in our democracy and the way we need to do better systematically at getting science advice that's high quality and separating that from the hard policy decisions.
All right, Sarah.
And I think it does highlight the challenges, frankly. I mean, I hope that we will come out of that, looking more to scientists. But what I see is some of the challenges around, what happens when the best information understood is updated, right? And so we started the pandemic, not wanting to have people wearing masks. And then there was a better understanding of how things spread. And, to me, it's not that the science was wrong at some point, but we learned more. And so we updated our understanding. And that's what science is. But that's really hard to communicate politically. It sounds like you're sort of changing your mind. And then similarly, people saying, well, we're not going to, have lockdowns until we have scientific proof that they work, which again is I think a misrepresentation of how science works and what it is. So I think it to me, it shows some of the pitfalls we need to try to avoid when we're using evidence-based policy. But I hope that we can come out of it better positioned to do so.
All right. Last word to our guest, Andrew Weaver.
So it's a good example. I'll just contrast two. One is Alberta, one is BC in terms of the pandemic response. BC has followed a very, very evidence-based approach. It's our numbers are, we get like 15 people on the island every day here. What has happened here is that the government, politicians have actually deferred to the public health officers almost exclusively. Whereas when I look at Alberta, being allowed because it's actually appealing to stakeholder bases. This is this is where you start to see the problem. I will give BC a lot of credit.
All right.
I think Alberta is filtering the Andrew's comments here.
We don't want to hear that national talk from BC.
Yeah, I'm going to come out with the official Alberta line. Sorry, Andrew, you were cut off there. So you're censored. You're censored by Alberta authorities.
Oh no! What I was saying is that it's contrasting BC and Alberta. I look at Alberta seems a very much more populist approach to pandemic response, whereas British Columbia was much more of a science-based approach, deferring to the public health officers. We have a one vaccine rollout strategy. We've got the peer-reviewed literature to support that. It's like going review now. The masks were introduced early in BC, the social distancing. It's just a very science-based approach here. And it seems a much more populist-based approach in Alberta. Who opens up rodeos just for stakeholder bases? This is not really good public policy in my particular.
Yeehaw!
Yeah, rodeos for everyone. The Alberta censors, Andrew, who just shut down your internet connection for a little bit, probably coming from Shaw.
Okay.
Their defense, and this is, I think, laughable, is that Alberta is ungovernable. You can't govern it because of the politics here. That would be another conversation for a whole separate show. But just so you know, that's what the censors, the official line is, we're too difficult to govern. That's why we're in this mess.
Okay.
Yeah. Okay. All right.
Better you than me. I would never want to be a politician in Alberta.
Yeah. On that comical note, let's wrap up the discussion. So, Andrew, thank you. This has been a delightful discussion. We're so grateful that you made the time to come on the show.
Thank you very much. It's been an honor and a pleasure.
Great. Our next episode is on June 3rd, 2 weeks from today. We're going to talk about carbon capture with Dr. Sally Benson of Stanford University. And given all the developments of carbon capture or carbon capture utilization and storage of late, you certainly won't want to miss that discussion. Give us feedback at energyversusclimate@gmail.com. We'll see you in 2 weeks' time. And Andrew, thank you again. Thanks for listening to Energy versus Climate. The show is created by David Keith, Sarah Hastings-Simon, and me, Ed Whittingham, and produced by Eva Voinigescu. Mika McFarlane provides webinar support. Our title and show music is The Wind-Up by Brian Lips. Sign up for updates and exclusive webinar access at energyversusclimate.com. Interact with us live every other week and subscribe to the podcast on Apple Podcasts, Stitcher, Spotify, or wherever you listen.